In 1982, a movie about a hostile alien creature in the midst of a small Arctic research team was released to theaters. Interestingly, this was in sharp contrast to Steven Spielberg's movie E.T., released the same year, which featured a nice alien. Although both movies had an impact on me as a kid, I'm here to talk about the first one. So sit back, relax, grab a beverage of some kind, and allow me to ramble on about the masterpiece of cinema known as The Thing. So, you're probably asking yourself, why is this strange man showing me a picture of a Mexican restaurant? Well, it was in a restaurant similar to this one in the early 1980s where I first heard about The Thing. You see, after we had all devoured our enchiladas and refried beans, my mother and an acquaintance of hers began discussing whatever it is mothers and their acquaintances talk about, while I sat quietly in the corner and began to thumb through the latest copy of Fangoria magazine. At some point I turned to an article previewing the latest film from director John Carpenter, and there on the page was a photo of the most insane-looking monster I had ever seen. Being a child fascinated with monsters, I was immediately intrigued. It's strange how these subtle moments in our childhood can often stick in our memory for years, or in my case decades, but I've never forgotten that day. And when I was finally able to see the movie, I was not disappointed. Although it could be considered a remake of 1951's The Thing from Another World, Carpenter's version is actually a more faithful interpretation of John W. Campbell's novella Who Goes There, written in 1938. You see, the original story focused more on an alien creature that could effectively mimic any living organism that it came into contact with. When the characters working in an Arctic research station discover this creature is among them, they begin to panic. It could even be argued that the feelings of paranoia and isolation are practically characters themselves. Carpenter has stated in several interviews that these elements were what he wanted to go back to and emphasize in his version. Although the original 1951 film featuring James Arness as the creature is considered a classic, and deservedly so, I always felt that this was a much more modern and faithful interpretation. Also, it's just damn disturbing. But in a good way. Although the film is usually looked upon fondly by horror and science fiction fans, I always felt that it deserved a bit more recognition than it garnered originally. A big reason for that are the amazing special effects, primarily created by Rob Bottin. Born in 1959, Rob grew up reading magazines like Famous Monsters, another of my favorite old magazines. After submitting some illustrations to effects artist Rick Baker at the age of 14, he was immediately hired. His involvement with The Thing began when he was hired by John Carpenter to create the special makeup effects on The Fog, released in 1980. Carpenter, impressed with his work, decided he should also be the guy to create the creature effects for The Thing. Although he did have some help from guys like Stan Winston and other effects artists, the majority of spooky stuff in the movie can be attributed to him. There's a great documentary on this Universal Collector's Edition DVD called Terror Takes Shape, filled with interviews from Carpenter as well as Kurt Russell and other actors in the film. But one of the most interesting interviews is with Bottin. According to the interview, at one point he actually worked at the studio 7 days a week, just trying to churn out all of the effects for the movie. In fact, he became so overworked that he actually ended up having to go to the hospital. I wish I was that dedicated. Or maybe not. The great thing about the effects in this movie are that they're all practical, and considering the state of computer hardware in the early 1980s, that was really your only option anyway. While I'm a big fan of computer graphics, there's really no substitute for putting an object in real space and having it look like it's, actually there. Although I freely admit CGI has come a long way in recent years. I can't let this review end without mentioning the cast and the amazing job they did in conveying the general uneasy tone of the film. Mccready, the reclusive helicopter pilot and arguably the most rational of the group, is portrayed by Kurt Russell. Mccready reluctantly takes charge of the situation when everything begins to fall apart. Supporting roles include Keith David as Childs, T.K. Carter as Knowles, David Clennon as Palmer, Richard Dysart as Dr. Copper, Charlie Hallahan as Norris, Peter Maloney as Bennings, Richard Masur as Clark, Donald Moffat as Gary, Joel Polis as Fuchs, Thomas Waits as Windows, and, of course, Wilford Brimley, who does a great job portraying Dr. Blair, the guy responsible for figuring out what's really going on and being generally suspicious of, well, pretty much everyone. Also, please note that I made no mention of oatmeal.
Throw them in a jar. Start an oatmeal fund.
Lastly, but certainly not least, we have Jed the Wolf Dog. In my opinion, Jed was an underrated and very talented canine. He deserves to be mentioned. I'm very aware of the fact that this entire review makes me sound like a John Carpenter fanboy, and I guess I kind of am. However, The Thing is an example of a horror movie done right, or at least how I interpret it done right. It's rare to see movies made these days that are able to match it, or even come close. Even the more recent film, released in 2011, which is basically a prequel, doesn't quite measure up. Although I did enjoy it since it details the events that occurred at the Norwegian camp. I actually wouldn't mind seeing more things like this, since they do expand on the universe. Well, I guess that about covers everything. As usual, if you have any comments or questions, you're certainly welcome to list them below. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to like it, or you can even consider subscribing to the channel. On that note, please take care, and of course, have fun.
Come on, man. You don't want to hurt anybody.
I'll kill you!